Welcome to the Unity and Struggle YouTube series on race and capitalism. Unity and Struggle is a revolutionary grouping, and in this moment, we see our role as mostly preparing the conditions for mass revolutionary movements to emerge. We do this by getting involved in local organizing, what some have termed base building work, and by taking theoretical study and reflection seriously. Many of us have participated in various waves of struggle, dating from the 2001 anti-war movement to the more recent 2014 and 2020 Black Lives Matter movements. At times, we do intensive national studies to help make sense of the conditions that are unfolding around us, and this is one of those times. We are very excited to continue our long-term study on race and capitalism and the mutually constituting relationships between the two. This episode covers the second section of part 2 of our race study. For part 1, we synthesize lessons periodically with the Rev Left Radio podcast and focus primarily on the antebellum period of the United States. You can find links to those interviews and our syllabi linked in the show notes, as well as on our website at unityandstruggle.org. We'll be continuing our study here on YouTube, and for part 2, we'll be covering 3 different sections: settler colonialism, Reconstruction in the United States, and segregation and industrialization. For this episode, we'll be discussing the second section on Reconstruction in the United States. We don't claim to be experts, but political co-thinkers attempting to understand one dimension of the social relations of our world. So thanks for joining us in this endeavor. Share, comment, and follow along. We'd love to hear from you in the comments or on social media. Our Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram is at Unity and Strug. My name is Leila, and I'll be facilitating this discussion with Eve and Diane. Okay, so let's get started. Diane, if you could run us through a brief timeline and the significant events for the Reconstruction era.
Definitely. We decided to lean on Eric Forner's text, America's Unfinished Revolution. And so we guided our timeline based on how he kind of chronicled what we understand to be the construction period. So the first hit, or the first, year that we can kind of pinpoint Reconstruction as a phase really starts with the 10% plan in 1863, where we were given perspective into thinking about how the federal government was waging with the plantation class of the South, pushing them to open up space and to consolidate to join the Union. So the 10% plan, or otherwise known as the Proclamation of Amnesty and Reconstruction, stated that a state only needed 10% of votes to join the Union, and that with this shift, property rights and also social relations would be restored, with exception, of course, of returning formerly enslaved and at that time emancipated Black folk. And this period is very important, 1863, because we begin to see the start of what we're going to talk about later as the general strike, where those that emancipated themselves from the plantations ran to organize places of the Union Army to work. And they were able to engage in wage labor in these places. And we'll turn back to that. But moving along, 1864 introduced the Wade-Davis bill. And so basically, the Republican North required that 50% of all voting members from the South would vote for the Union, and this would instate the right for Black men to vote. And this was vetoed by Abraham Lincoln, so this bill did not pass. In late 1864 to early 1865, we really held and spent time thinking through what is known as the Field Order 15, which was enacted by General Sherman. So this general was working under Ulysses Grant, and he was in charge of the Western Theater. And what he ended up doing was dismantling cotton and indigo plantation infrastructures. He stopped the trade, disrupt processing. And when you captured Atlanta, and this is important to note, that turn demonstrated to the South that the Union was going to win, and that actually was that moment actually pushed Lincoln into office. So under Sherman, the federal government confiscates much of the land of the East Coast from the Carolinas, including the Sea Islands where the indigenous Gullah Geechee are, all the way down to Florida. And that covered about 400,000 acres of land. And this land under the Field Order Act was redistributed to Black families under the guidance of Black religious abolitionists from the North. This activity sparked the common phrase, 40 acres and a mule, as once note of this was happening, it spread throughout the South, which stimulated more enslaved folks to emancipate themselves and move toward Union-captured places in the South. 1865, Lincoln dies, of course, April 1865, assassinated. And then by May, Andrew Johnson becomes president. By December 1865, the 13th Amendment is ratified, ending slavery, quote unquote, except as punishment for a crime. We also see in this timeline, this particular year, the ambitions of Reconstruction under Lincoln kind of shifts within the federal government under Johnson. So much of the land that was redistributed under General Sherman was confiscated back by the federal government and redistributed back to the Southern plantation class. We also see the kind of disintegration, the disvolvement of the Freedmen's Bureau, and more so the role of the Freedmen's Bureau, right? And we see the increase of the Black codes, introduction of Black codes. And so that includes laws that were maintained to reinforce a social relation similar to plantation. So the element of vagrancy laws, for example, which forced Black folks into contract work, which ended up also being mitigated by the Freedmen's Bureau as an example. The reinforcement of sharecropping, trespassing laws as well. So Black freed folk could not be mobile and leave these former plantation areas toward areas where they could actually engage in free wage labor. We also see the increase of plantation and state vigilante groups that were organized. They organized themselves to control free Black labor. And later on this year becomes the actual official year that the KKK, the Ku Klux Klan, announces themselves as an organization. So 1867, we have the official Reconstruction Act, which basically called for Southern states to rewrite their state constitution with the inclusion of ratifying the 13th and 14th Amendment. And they needed to do this to be able to actually officially enter the Union. This act also called for them to document that their state would support the freedom and protection of private property of formerly enslaved and now free Black folks. 1868, we have the 14th Amendment, which restored full U.S. citizenship to all those born and naturalized in the United States, including those formerly enslaved of African descent. 1870, we had, of course, the 15th Amendment, which proclaimed the protection of Black men's right to vote. So by the early 1870s, you had an increase of Black government elected officials in Congress. The highest number reached 600 representatives in state legislature. And 1871, there was the KKK Act of 1871, which called for federal investigation against Klan terror, and the Civil Rights Act of 1875, which called for desegregation of public transportation. Both of those acts were overturned. Although the Act of 1871 was successful in curbing racial terror, both acts actually gave way to what we understand to be the premise of Jim Crow through the Compromise of 1877, which the Compromise of 1877 essentially was a negotiation between the Republican Party and moderate Democrats of the South to ensure that contentiously elected President Haynes would be able to secure the vote of moderate Democrats to secure his position in office. And so the trade-off was that the government would remove federal troops from larger southern cities like New Orleans, Atlanta, and kind of forego the kind of observations and federal legal apparatus in these areas, which gave way to the South reorganizing itself under what we now know to be Jim Crow law.
Wow, so that is like a period of like tremendous upheaval, it seems like. So I guess a good place to start might be with the general strike that you mentioned earlier. What do you see as the meaning of the general strike, and why is it important?
Definitely. I think the general strike is super important to insert before the end of the Civil War, in that, as I mentioned, as the Union troops began to dismantle the infrastructure of these plantation networks, cotton plantations, indigo plantations of the South, enslaved folks emancipated themselves so they could join these taken over Union territories in the South for wage labor. And so we leaned a lot on WEB Bois's text, Black Reconstruction, to think through this moment and time period. And so I kind of want to uplift a quote that he wrote, which is, he said, "The easiest thing to say was that Negroes were tired of work and wanted to live at the expense of the government, wanted to travel and see things and places. But in contradiction to this was the extent of the movement and the terrible suffering of the refugees. If they were seeking peace and quiet, they were much better off on the plantations than trailing in the footsteps of the army or squatting miserably in the camps. They were mistreated by the soldiers, ridiculed, driven away, and yet they came. They increased with every campaign, and as a final gesture, they marched with Sherman from Atlanta to the sea, met the refugees, and abandoned human property on the Sea Islands and the Carolina coast. This was not merely the desire to stop work. It was a strike on a wide basis against the conditions of work. It was a general strike that involved directly, in the end, perhaps 500,000 people. They wanted to stop the economy of the plantation system, and to do that, they left the plantations." So essentially what W.E.B. Du Bois gave us was a way to kind of reconcile this notion that the North came to reconstruct, and the North's intervention, especially the Union Army in the South, was there to adjust or reform wage relations. That's not the case. What Du Bois gives us is this understanding that it was their disruption and their ability to take advantage of a moment that allowed them to reinsert themselves and push toward themselves being considered within a now free labor construct. So, yeah, as the Union went further south and westward, enslaved folks emancipated themselves, and they migrated to the Union Army camps. And their activity during and post-war explicitly broke down property and labor relations. Another quote from Du Bois was that Negroes worked fewer hours and had more time for self-expression. There was no plan to this exodus, no Moses to lead it. The result was a huge labor shortage in the South, the product of 1/3 decline in the supply of black labor as measured by total hours worked. That drove up wages and improved working conditions. To attract laborers in 1866 and 1867, many planters found it necessary to promise additional pay for harvest work and offer land for garden plots. This statement is super integral for us toward understanding the continuities and the afterlives of this type of the strike, of the general strike, post 1865. As we sat and kind of worked through wage relations in cities like Atlanta, a city that had to be reconstructed, we were able to sit with oral histories, documents that gave us insight to how even gendered labor was able to kind of negotiate, gendered racialized labor was able to negotiate in ways that it hadn't been before, just by the essence of lack of forced labor in these areas. Also, the ability for these that were newly emancipated to demand a particular wage against Northerners who had come into the South expecting that they would get lower wages and take advantage of this kind of reconstruction of the South was also very important for us to sit with as we looked at this section.
Okay, awesome. It seems like the general strike was like an important moment where Black folks like came into their own subjectivity, and that created changes as well. So it's really awesome to like see that happened and that it's possible. So Eve, in terms of the political factions that emerged around this time, can you talk about what they were?
Yeah, and I think that the importance of the general strike kind of speaks to the different political factions that emerged in this time and sort of the power of formerly enslaved people in this moment. And so, unity and struggle were, I'm going to be honest, we're complete nerds. Like everybody in UNS and all of our friends are nerds. And if you've been following this series, you're a nerd too.
Yep.
So we couldn't help but bring in some secondary texts and kind of relate some Marxism to some of the findings and some of the discussions that we're having and have some debate around that. So one of the things that we brought in was on a side conversation was the Marxist framework of a historical party versus a formal party. And a historical party can be some sort of like informal articulation of activity. It allows for some messiness across political lines and ideologies and relationships and people. And in this case, we see a historical party emerge around the pro-slave power, and a separate one around the Northern Free Labor, that's like quote unquote Free Labor Capital Alliance, and then a third one which is abolitionists. And I think I think we need to spend a little bit more time with the abolitionist question, so I'm going to set that one aside and we'll come back to that. But I think generally you hear the story of the Civil War and the abolition of slavery as a North versus South divide, but we wanted to kind of problematize that. And I think using this framework of the historical party versus the formal party helps us sort of complicate that narrative. So in this sense, the historical party of the pro-slave power includes, which the slave power bloc is actually a term that was coined by Frederick Douglass. But applying the historical party framework to that, we see that as the planter class broadly, but that also includes people in the North who supported the preservation of slavery. And the sort of more formal articulation of this is the Democratic Party and the Confederate Army. The second major coalition, is the Northern Free Labor, quote unquote, Capital Alliance, which seeks to discipline the Slave Power Alliance and the abolitionists in favor of preserving the benefits of enslaved people's labor while expanding the exploitative free labor system. So the historical party of this coalition includes people North and South who want to see capitalism extended, but without abolishing slavery. And then, of course, the formal articulation of this coalition is the Republican Party and the Union Army, and then later the Freedmen's Bureau. So in this sense, these coalitions are antagonistic, but also in some ways compatible. And they don't strictly fall along North-South lines. it was important in our exploration of this section to sort of excavate the ways the North was both complicit in and then actively in favor of the slave system. And, I think that there's this old debate on the left and, kind of on the far left of like the communization tendencies and other tendencies where they're looking at the question of slavery and whether slavery is a capitalistic form. And, we sort of decided early on in the study that question doesn't really make sense, and that slavery is an essential component of capitalism, and it was necessary for capitalism to accumulate, to go through its primitive accumulation processes that it's constantly renewing. So we're wanting to sort of complicate this sort of like North-South divide and this sense that the North, was against slavery in some way. But, these political coalitions sort of help us understand that, there's a lot more going on there. And then just to highlight all of this playing out in an example that I think Diane mentioned a little bit, is the broad agreement on the need for the U.S. to expand west in this moment, and a mutual commitment along these political coalitions toward settler colonialism as a strategy to, continue to move west. However, the question of whether these new Western states would be slave states was an open question across both political coalitions. So the precarious agreement on settler colonialism actually revealed a crack in the ruling class that could be pulled apart and weakened, given the right wedge. So the wedge in this example, though, there could be many, and there have been many historically, but in this example, it was the self-activity of enslaved people themselves, like you said, and the support of the white and non-Black people of color who took various positions and actions toward abolition. So yeah, this is what constitutes this sort of third political coalition or historical party in this moment, the abolitionists.
Okay, I really love the complication, I guess, of making it about more than just North versus South. So yeah, let's spend a little more time on the abolitionists. How are you defining abolitionism, and what was the significance of abolition for capitalism in this moment?
Yeah, I'll try and take that on. We really had to sit with the current wave of abolition as a movement and think through that in accordance to how we've also been generally taught about the Civil War leading into Reconstruction and abolition as a moral issue. And thinking about the North, we're always convinced that the North was the liberal, thus moral apparatus against the South. And, I just want to reiterate and really support what Eve is saying, which is we've learned the dimensionality to how the ruling class was able to mitigate between North and South to sustain a planter class and turn that into, the fortification of the industrialized North. But with that being said, thinking through how the abolitionist movement became the stimuli for anti-slavery in the United States actually takes us outside of the United States. So the abolitionist movement, as it became politicized and sustained by the Republican North, really actually started in England with the end of slavery and the slave trade political narrative that started there. And as studiers of historical Marxism, we know that it didn't actually stop, right? But it became this political attaché that moved to the United States. And so what we found to be super interesting was that even within this kind of paradigm of abolitionism, you had those who understood abolition in the framework of W.E. Bois, which is, a dialectical processing where you're thinking through the economic and political and social capital for all members of a nation state or whatever to live as equal members, right? And so that's one strand that one can kind of pull into today's understanding of abolition, especially within abolitionist movements that address the prison industrial complex. But you also had abolitionists who leaned on the infrastructure created by other civil society organizations like the church, right? So you had the abolitionists who were tied to the northern churches, and on this moral epitaph, they were motivated to push toward the end of slavery, but also to reinforce a type of parochial, patriarchal structure in the South. And we saw that different cultural splits, moral divisions within this type of abolitionist thinking, particularly around the elites in these circles, traveled through the infrastructures that were set from groups like the Freedmen's Bureau, but also religious organizations that had intent on reorganizing the South, yes, past slavery, but also within locked infrastructure to support the kind of parochial institutions that were formed in the North. So, leaning on the text by Carrico, which you all can kind of check out on, I think it's linked, and how Carrico is thinking with Saidiya Hartman around formal abolition and abolition in essence, calls for us to kind of question what abolition meant during that period and if it was achievable under that framework of that time, and or was emancipation used more of as a political sentiment as opposed to the actual act of emancipation, which one could argue that it was not successful. Emancipation was not successful, although there was all of this law and policy infrastructure statutes that claimed that they were seeking and wanted to fortify emancipation. So these were the kinds of things that we played with in regards to abolition of that time period, how it was politically used as a term to organize different facets of the elite, and also what claims were made through emancipation and abolition for the newly emancipated folks of African descent who were trying to renegotiate and insert themselves into wage labor in these newly formed cities like Atlanta and whatnot, New Orleans. And we came to learn that the Freedmen's Bureau was a site to chronicle and trace all of this. I kind of want to add to spend time on thinking about the Freedmen's Bureau as a federal infrastructure. We came across a case study that did, advance that the Freedmen's Bureau was able to create schools, different infrastructures that were not there before federal infrastructures. Yet at the same time, the Freedmen's Bureau also policed contract labor, forced and mitigated, acted as a legal apparatus to sustain a particular type of exploited labor for northern business folks and the planter class. So we see how the Freedmen's Bureau was definitely a tool, but not necessarily an actor of emancipation. And we turn back to Du Bois, who gives us this language of reminding us that the act of emancipation really did come as part of, or the process of emancipation came as part of those who emancipated themselves from the plantations.
Okay. So I feel like with many ideas that start to take hold, eventually it's like a ticking time bomb before they get co-opted by capitalism. So I'm wondering how the struggle for abolition and other struggles in this moment got subsumed into capitalism.
Yeah, that's a great way to put it. I think it's the dialectic of our of history, is to, for the working class and and oppressed and exploited people to throw up struggle, and then that to be subsumed under capitalism, and just kind of this cycle to go back and forth. And yeah, I mean, so unfortunately, we know the end of this story. We know that at the end of the general strike during the early 1860s, there was no successful revolution. There was sort of an insurrectionary moment. There was some potential in that moment, but unfortunately, there was no break with the society in that form, which I think, kind of lends some strength to the Saidiya Hartman, Aaron Carrico argument about, there not being a radical break in this moment, which we found pretty intriguing, if not, maybe complete, but helpful. But yeah, I think so. Knowing the end of the story, that there was no successful revolution, we see that capital is able to subsume various forms of struggle. And I'll give a couple of examples. Earlier, Diane mentioned the Sea Islands, where the Union Army found itself at the end of the war, off the southwest coast. And there's an early experiment in quote unquote free labor on the Sea Islands. Basically, the U.S. government seized property because of unpaid taxes and awarded the land to formerly enslaved people. So in the longer run, the lands proved to not be very valuable, and a severe drought following the Civil War created a crisis, which the communities were not prepared to withstand and really couldn't withstand. And in our reading of this, we kind of drew a parallel to the Lakota people who were given a treaty that awarded them stewardship over a land. And in the contract, it said, wherever the buffalo shall roam, which afforded the U.S. government a loophole once they killed off all the buffalo. So here, similarly, there's sort of an extension of land to people, and a disavowalment of that land as part of the longer term racialization process. And then I also want to touch on the Freedmen's Bureau. I think Diane was, nice in making sure to mention, the schools and sort of the positive institutions. But I think in general, our sense through the study was kind of a pessimistic or negative understanding of the Freedmen Bureau's role. And I think Diane laid that out nicely, as a way to manage and subsume the self-activity of recently freed people. So the initial intent of the Freedmen's Bureau was to redistribute resources. So again, that 40 acres and a mule sort of institution, and institute a radical reconstruction in the South, including enforcing protections for formerly enslaved people. But by as early as 1865, which is, very soon after emancipation, the Bureau was enacting the policies of the Northern capitalists and the former planter class that was reconstituted under formal abolition. Many formerly enslaved people saw leveraging the Bureau and the new free labor contracts and an ability to withhold labor as a strategic way to gain better living conditions and better working conditions. And Diane mentioned the case study of Atlanta as an example, which I think was a really good example. Black women basically formed a whole network of domestic laborers. They engaged in some small collective actions. They shared tips and warnings about terrible employers. They supported each other in resigning or migrating elsewhere. And a lot of people in this moment were looking to the Bureau for support as a tool to leverage over their employers and former enslavers. But unfortunately, the Bureau wasn't very helpful. It began to resemble the kind of terrible bureaucratic arm of the state we all know and love. Picture calling, the Medicaid line during COVID, which, you can't get through to anyone. It's like a terrible, you're being told that there's understaffing, lack of resources, etc. But instead, you're relying on the state to provide relief for wage theft and physical violence and potential death by employers and former enslavers. And basically, they rarely solved any of these disputes in the favor of the formerly enslaved people. And they kind of dragged shit out and sort of, again, pointed to understaffing and lack of resources. Another example to sort of drive the point home around the Bureau, its role was also to discipline people into nuclear families. And so again, this is sort of an institution of Northern capitalism that's being imposed among formerly enslaved populations. The intention of the Bureau around this was initially to assist in reuniting families that had been broken up by slavery, but in practice, the Bureau enforced marriage contracts, especially among single women and those deemed, quote unquote, sexually deviant. And they also served as an early version of CPS, forcing kids into work programs and disciplining those who resisted. And really, overall, much of society as we know it today is based on this moment in history, this Reconstruction moment, and this assumption of the general strike and the ongoing forms of struggle that Black people engaged in the general strike and afterwards as a continuation of this struggle. So we saw absenteeism, migration, demanding and enforcing contracts, various forms of collective action, armed self-defense, straight up insurrection in moments. And the reaction to these struggles and the state policies thrown up in the Reconstruction moment are echoed in today's forms of sort of repression and sort of bureaucracy. So some examples, we see it in the state finance nexus via the labor and profit speculation processes. We see it in city planning strategies, particularly around investment and reinvestment cycles. And of course, the modern day prison and policing systems, which are synonymous with Black criminalization in the Black Code via the Black codes and the peonage system and the penal labor system that Diane was mentioning.
I'm glad you mentioned the similarities between the Reconstruction period and now, because I definitely felt that kind of recognition as I was going through the text. So what are some of the practical implications of all of these historical lessons?
I'll try and take that on. I think, especially in our post-pandemic moment, thinking around labor, accessibility, has kind of created this disrupt. And so the media, social movement has kind of drawn parallels between the general strike and what's being called today as the Great Resignation. And, we sat with it and we kind of played out some of the, episodes that we can kind of tie between both moments in time, thinking about the general strike and, mobility, and how people are, looking toward companies that allow for that type of mobility. Or, for example, now the labor organizing movement with bigger corporations like Amazon and Starbucks and the struggle for unionizing, seeing it start and stop. To be frank, right, we're not necessarily talking about the general strike in that context, because of course that's a time period where we're speaking about enslaved labor that emancipated itself and pushed toward wage labor. And in this moment, we're looking at, a truly deindustrialized labor moment and movement trying to reconfigure and reorganize itself. However, we can kind of think through the afterlives of Reconstruction, which, as Eve mentioned and I mentioned earlier, Black codes, the increase of racialized carcerality, policing, and that existing today, and prison uprisings historically being an answer to that as it existed during that time period, thinking through the general strike as it truly, as Du Bois laid out in his text, small scale, continuous. And so the small revolts, the small insurrection, small groups fleeting, facilitating kind of a tipping point against the state, allows us to kind of think through our moment now. So we played a lot with kind of spontaneity versus organized strikes and whatnot, and thinking through how Du Bois lays out the general strike not as a moment, especially as how we're thinking about the Great Resignation, but as continuous small revolts, like I said, practices of refusal, insurrection, as a larger sense of resistance and organized resistance.
All right, excellent. So what is next for this study? What are your next steps?
So we still have a few kind of lingering questions from this section that we want to continue to flesh out as we keep going through this study. It was an incredibly juicy section. It gave us a lot to think about in terms of race formation and the relationship between race and capital. But we definitely had some sort of sticky points of debate and areas that we didn't get to. So I think one thing in particular that we didn't get to is the question of ongoing settler colonialism in this moment. We touched on earlier about the West as sort of a wedge between slave states and free states, and how and why certain compromises occurred around that. But importantly, we didn't touch on how that affected Indigenous people and how Indigenous people fought back. So I think that's an area that we need to continue to research and discuss. And then also, we didn't fully flesh out the relationship between formerly enslaved people and other forms of unfree labor in this moment. And I think the last thing that we flagged is that we were really intrigued with the method that called 1865 into question as, whether there was a radical break in this moment. And I think we'll use that as a framework for understanding how race shifts in times of crises, though I think we need to dig a little deeper to fill in that content in the next sections. And in terms of the next section, so we're going to be looking at the American industrialization and rise of Jim Crow and segregation. And so roughly the timing of that is 1880s to 1930s. And then after that, we'll take a few months off from our study to finalize the 20th and 21st century section. So people can watch for one more recording coming soon. And then our final syllabus for the series will be dropping sometime this fall.
All right, that sounds exciting. I look forward to it. Okay, so I think that this concludes this episode. I'm thankful to Unity and Struggle for putting on this race study, and to Eve and Diane in particular for sharing their thoughts and analysis here. Like Eve mentioned, there's one more section of part 2 to the race study, so be sure to subscribe or to join us in our research. Thanks so much for joining us in this endeavor, and please share and comment on this episode to expand our reach. We'd like to hear from you on social media as well. Our Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram is Unity and Strug. Thanks.